bucket slipped from Sarah's hands before she could catch it. Water splashed across the mud, soaking the hem of her worn dress, and the sound of it hitting the ground echoed louder than it should have in the sudden, terrible silence that had fallen over Ashvale. She did not look down. She did not look at the spilled water, or the muddy ground, or the ruined cloth. She looked straight ahead, because straight ahead was where the danger was, and Sarah had learned a long time ago that looking away from danger never made it smaller. The man on the horse was looking at her. He was not like anyone she had ever seen. He sat on a black horse, so large it seemed like something from a dream, and he wore armor that caught the pale morning light and gave nothing back. His face was sharp and still, the kind of face that did not change no matter what it was looking at, and his eyes were pale gray, the color of the sky, just before a storm decides it has waited long enough. Around him rode 6 other warriors in the same dark armor, but they were looking at the village, at the elders, at the ground. He was looking at her. The convoy had come without warning, which was its own kind of warning. Ashvale sat deep in the northern highlands, far from the roads that mattered, and no one of consequence had ridden through its gates in years. But the flags on the convoy's lead horse were unmistakable even to Sarah, who had not been allowed to attend the schooling sessions where the children learned such things. She had learned them anyway, from listening through walls and reading discarded papers. The silver wolf on a field of black, the banner of the Lycan king. She should have moved. She knew that. Every person in the village who had not already dropped to one knee was pressing themselves against fences and walls, trying to become invisible. But her feet had stopped working the moment the convoy rounded the hill, and now the bucket was on the ground, and the water was soaking into the earth, and the king of all the Lycan bloodlines was looking at her, and she could not make herself look away. One of his warriors edged his horse forward. "Move aside," the man said, his voice flat and professional, the voice of someone who gave the same order many times a day and felt nothing about it. Sarah moved. She stepped to the left, pressing herself against the wooden fence that ran along the water path, and she lowered her gaze to the ground, the way she had been taught to do when anyone of rank passed by. Her heart was hammering. Her hands were cold. The convoy moved forward. She thought it was over. She thought she could breathe. Then she heard the horses stop. The silence that followed was different from the first one. The first silence had been shock. This one was anticipation. She could feel the weight of every eye in the village shifting, could hear the collective held breath of 60 people who sensed something was happening and were afraid to look directly at it. Sarah looked up. The king had stopped his horse 10 feet from her. He was still looking at her. His expression had not changed, but something in his eyes had, something she could not name, and was not sure she wanted to. He was not looking at her the way the elders looked at her, with that particular mix of disgust and satisfaction that came from people who needed someone beneath them to feel tall. He was looking at her the way someone looks at a word they recognize but cannot place, a face that belongs to a memory they cannot quite reach. "You," he said. His voice was low and even, and carried the kind of weight that had nothing to do with volume. It was the voice of someone who had never once in his life wondered whether he would be heard. Sarah's throat was dry. "Me," she said, and then immediately wondered why she had said that, because it was possibly the least useful thing she could have offered. Something happened at the corner of his mouth. It was not quite a smile. It was the idea of one, passing through quickly, and leaving before it could be identified. Elder Croft materialized at the edge of the path with the speed of a man who knew his position was in danger. He was the oldest of Ashvale's council, broad and white-haired, and accustomed to being the most important person in any room. He was not accustomed to being ignored, which was what was happening now. "My king," Croft said, dipping into a bow that cost him more than he wanted it to. "Welcome to Ashvale. We are honored beyond words by your presence. If you would allow me to escort you to the council hall, we have prepared." "What is her name?" the king said. He had not looked at Croft. He was still looking at Sarah. Croft hesitated. In that hesitation, Sarah heard everything she had always known about her place in this village. The pause before her name, the brief calculation of what to say and how much to admit, the quiet decision about whether she was worth claiming. "That is Sarah," Croft said, and his voice was carefully neutral in the way that only careful neutrality sounds. "She is one of our. She assists with the water work. Forgive her for being in your path, my king. She is harmless." Harmless. Sarah had been called many things in her 20 years, but harmless always felt like the sharpest one, because it reduced her to something with no potential in either direction, something that simply existed and caused no change in the world. The king finally looked at Croft. "I did not ask if she was harmless," he said. "I asked for her name." "Sarah," Croft repeated, and this time there was a thread of nerves in it. "Sarah." The king said her name once, quietly, as though he was checking how it felt. Then he looked back at her. "How long have you lived here?" No one asked her questions, not questions directed at her, expecting her to answer, treating her answer as the one that mattered. Sarah blinked once. "All my life," she said. His eyes dropped for just a moment, to her wrist. The birthmark there was visible because her sleeve had been pushed up for waterwork. A pale silver mark against her inner wrist, shaped roughly like a crescent with a small, irregular star beside it. She had covered it since she was old enough to understand that it frightened people. She had forgotten to cover it this morning, because she had been rushing, and she was always rushing. She pulled her sleeve down. The king's gaze returned to her face. He studied her for another moment, and she stood very still under it, the way she had learned to stand still under the elders' inspections. Though this felt nothing like those. He was not looking for something wrong with her. He seemed to be looking for something he already suspected was right. "Continue," he said, and she thought for a moment he was speaking to her. But then the convoy moved forward again, and he rode with it, and Sarah stood against the fence until the last horse had passed, and then she leaned back into the wood and breathed. Around her, the village exhaled all at once. People straightened up from their bows and their pressed-against-walls positions and immediately began talking in urgent, hushed voices. Sarah did not join them. She picked up the empty bucket and walked back to the well. Her hands were still cold. Her heart was still loud. But underneath both of those things, something small and unfamiliar was turning over in her chest, and she did not know what to call it yet. She called it nothing. It was safer that way. Sarah had been declared impure at 3 days old. It was Elder Croft's predecessor who had made the declaration, a woman named Alda who had held the council chair for 40 years, and who died believing she had never made a single wrong decision in her life. She had looked at the silver mark on the infant's wrist, consulted her books, and announced to Sarah's parents that the child carried a curse mark. Ancient texts, Alda had said, old warnings about children born with this sign. They would bring disorder. They would disrupt the natural bonds of the pack. They could not be bonded to a mate and should not be given rank. Sarah's mother had wept. Her father had gone very quiet, in the way men go quiet when they want to argue but do not believe they have the right. Neither of them had defied the council. They had raised her, loved her in the cautious and apologetic way of people who love something the world has told them not to. And then both of them had died in the same winter illness when Sarah was 11, and the council had decided that she would earn her place in Ashvale through work. She had been working ever since. She carried water in the mornings. She cleaned the council hall in the afternoons. She helped with food preparation during pack gatherings, the ones she was not allowed to attend as a guest. She fixed roofs and mended fences and swept paths and did all the things that needed doing and were beneath the notice of people with rank. She was not treated cruelly. That was the thing people said when they wanted to feel good about the situation. She is not treated cruelly, they said. She has a roof and food. She is simply given purpose. Purpose. As if a life built entirely for the convenience of others was something to be grateful for. She was not angry about it, mostly. She had been angry as a child, fiercely and hopelessly angry, and the anger had burned through a lot of years before settling into something quieter. Now it lived in her like a low fire, not roaring, just present, warm enough to keep her moving forward, not hot enough to make her do something that would only hurt herself. She had one room in the building that stored extra supplies. It had a window that faced east, which meant she could see the sunrise if she woke early enough. She had one shelf of books that she had gathered over the years, some given, some found, some borrowed from the council library when she was certain no one was watching. She had a blanket her mother had made. She had nothing else, nothing that belonged to her, nothing she had chosen. The convoy's arrival changed the texture of Ashvale immediately and completely. The village was not a large place, and the presence of the Lycan king and his escort filled it the way a stone fills a small pool. Everything shifted. Everything felt the weight of it. The council hall was suddenly alive with activity. The elders were in conference all morning. Fires were started in the main hearth that was usually only lit for festivals. Sarah worked through all of it, moving around the edges as she always did. She refilled the water barrels near the council hall, which meant she was close enough to hear voices through the open window. Not scheduled, Croft was saying. His voice was tight. The king was not due to survey this region for another 8 months. The king does not owe us a schedule, another elder said. That was Fenwick, younger than Croft, usually the voice of practical concern. He goes where he chooses. We should be honored. We should be prepared, Croft said. There are things in this village that do not benefit from scrutiny. Sarah's hands slowed on the barrel lid. You mean the girl, Fenwick said. A pause. I mean our records are not in order, Croft said carefully. The council's documentation of certain customs may not look favorable under royal inspection. Sarah set the lid down quietly. She lifted her empty buckets. She walked away at a normal pace, which was the only pace she ever used when she needed to think, because running attracted attention, and standing still felt like drowning. So the elders were worried about the king looking too closely, worried about him looking too closely at her. She turned that over for the rest of the afternoon. It sat alongside the memory of his pale gray eyes on her face, the way he had asked her name like the answer genuinely mattered, the way he had looked at the mark on her wrist with something that was not disgust or fear. She was in the storage building, sitting on her bed with her knees pulled up and one of her books open in her lap, when the knock came. 2 knocks, a pause, then one more, like someone who was uncertain of the protocol. She opened the door. A young woman in dark armor stood there. She was smaller, with a sharp face and watchful eyes, and she was holding a folded cloth. You are Sarah? The woman asked. Yes. The king requests that you present yourself at the main hall at sunrise tomorrow. She held out the cloth. He asks that you wear this. Sarah looked at the cloth. She did not take it immediately. Why? The woman's eyes were not unkind. He did not say why. He only said please. Sarah took the cloth. Inside it was a dress, simple but clean and well made, in a deep green that she had never owned anything in. Not because she had been told she could not wear that color, simply because she had never owned anything with color at all. All right, Sarah said. The woman nodded and left. Sarah closed the door and stood in the middle of her small room for a long time, holding the green dress, feeling the weight of it, which was not heavy at all but felt like the heaviest thing she had held in years. She did not sleep well that night. She lay awake, watching the darkness outside her window, and thinking about pale gray eyes and the way a voice could be low and still fill every corner of the space around it. She thought about the mark on her wrist, which she pressed her thumb against now, tracing its shape in the dark the way she had done 1,000 times, always waiting to feel something from it, always feeling nothing but her own pulse underneath. When the first thin light of morning came through her window, she got up. She washed her face and combed her hair and put on the green dress, which fit her well enough to be strange, as though it had been made with some knowledge of her. She looked at herself in the small piece of mirror she kept above her shelf. She looked like herself, but she looked like a version of herself that had been taken seriously. She tucked her hair behind one ear. She rolled her sleeve down to cover her wrist. Then she stopped and looked at the mark and made a small and quiet decision. She rolled her sleeve back up. Then she walked out of the storage building, through the morning stillness of Ashvale, toward the council hall, and she held her chin, the way her mother had always told her to, level and forward, like you have as much right to be anywhere as anyone else, because you do, even when they make you feel like you do not. The morning was cold and clean, and the sun was just beginning to turn the edges of things gold, and for the first time in as long as she could remember, Sarah felt like she was walking toward something, instead of away from it. She did not know yet what it was, but she walked toward it anyway. The council hall door was open. The light inside was warm. She could see the silhouette of a man standing with his back to the door, looking at the wall where the village record scrolls were kept. He turned when she stepped inside. The king looked at her for a long moment, then his eyes moved to her wrist, to the uncovered mark, and something shifted in his expression. Not surprise, something closer to recognition. You came, he said. You said please, she said. His mouth did that thing again, the almost smile, moving through quickly, and gone before it could be pinned down. He gestured to the chairs near the central table. Sit, he said. Then, after a beat, please. Sarah sat. The fire in the hearth was the only sound for a moment, crackling steadily, unbothered by kings or curses or the weight of 20 years of being called impure. She folded her hands on the table, her marked wrist facing up, and waited to find out what her life was going to do next. The king's name was Cale Draven, though Sarah had not been formally told this. She had read it years ago, in a piece of the Royal Chronicle she had found wedged between two heavier books in the council library. She had read it and remembered it the way she remembered all things she was not supposed to know, carefully and privately, turning the information over in her mind until she understood the shape of it. Cale Draven, the Alpha King of the Lycan bloodlines, ruler of every wolf pack from the northern highlands to the southern coasts. The 15th in his line, which meant he came from a family that had held power for longer than the village of Ashvale had existed. He was said to be fair but not lenient. He was said to be old, though he did not look it, because the old Lycan bloodlines aged differently from common wolf packs. She had read all of that and filed it away, and thought she would never have reason to use it. Now he was sitting across a table from her, his armor exchanged for a dark shirt and a plain coat, looking less like a figure from Royal Chronicle pages, and more like a man who had not slept well. He had poured water from the pitcher on the table. He had offered her a cup before he poured his own, which was such a small thing, and so different from everything she was used to, that she had almost not known what to do with it. She drank the water. It was just water. "I want to ask you about your mark," he said. There was no preamble. She appreciated that. She had spent enough years in rooms where people worked up to saying things they could have simply said. "All right," she said. "How long have you had it?" "Since birth." She set the cup down. "The elders here say it appeared at 3 days old, though I have no memory of that myself. Has anyone ever explained to you what it is?" She looked at him steadily. "They explained what it is not. I am not pure. I cannot be bonded. I cannot hold rank. I bring disorder to the pack's natural connections." She kept her voice flat, not because she felt nothing about it, but because the feeling was old, and she had learned not to carry it in her voice, which only made people uncomfortable in ways that never helped her. He was quiet for a moment. He looked at her wrist. "May I?" She held out her arm. He did not touch her skin. He leaned forward and looked at the mark closely, the way someone examines something they are trying to match to a memory. His expression was very still. The fire crackled. Outside, the village was beginning its morning sounds, the movement of people and animals, the ordinary noise of a place waking up. "The elders were wrong," he said. She did not react immediately. She had learned not to. About which part? All of it. He sat back. His eyes came up to meet hers. "This is called the Lunaris mark. It appears in old Lycan scripture, in texts that are very old, older than most village councils know to look for. It is not a curse." He paused, choosing his next words, with what she could see was unusual care. "It is a bond mark. Specifically, it identifies a person who carries a connection to a Lycan king's bloodline. A fated bond. The mark appears in the generation it is meant for." Sarah was very still. "In the old king's time," he continued, "the Lunaris mark was considered sacred. A person born with it was brought to the royal seat, recognized, protected." His jaw tightened briefly. "What your elders did instead was convenient," she said. He stopped. "For them," she said, "it was convenient, a mark they did not recognize, on a child they did not want to invest in, from parents who did not have enough rank to fight back. They called it a curse, and used it to make me useful to them, in the only way they could imagine." She kept her voice level. She had said it out loud before, in the dark of her room, practicing for a conversation she never actually expected to have. "I am not surprised they were wrong. I am a little surprised you are telling me they were." He studied her. There was something in the way he looked at her that made her feel seen rather than inspected, which was a difference she was not used to. "I am telling you," he said slowly, "because it is the truth, and because you are the one it concerns most, and because—" He stopped again. "Because," she prompted, "because the Lunaris mark in your generation corresponds to my bloodline." He said it evenly, watching her face. "Which means the bond the mark indicates is connected to me." The fire crackled. A horse outside made a sound. Sarah heard all of it very clearly, as though the world had gotten quieter so she could think. "You are saying," she said carefully, That the mark the elders called a curse is actually a mark that connects me to you. Yes. And that the people who made my entire life small based on that mark were simply wrong. Yes. She looked at the table. She looked at her wrist. She looked back at him. How do you know? She asked. It was not an accusation. It was a genuine question, asked in the tone of someone who has learned things the hard way. He reached into the inner pocket of his coat and removed a folded paper. He opened it and laid it on the table between them. It was a copy of a very old document, the writing in an archaic script she partly recognized from her stolen hours in the council library. At the bottom of the page was a drawing of a mark. She looked at it and then looked at her wrist. They were identical. My general carries a collection of old lineage documents, Cale said. He is thorough to a point that most people find unnecessary. When I described your mark to him last night, he had found the reference within an hour. Sarah kept looking at the drawing on the page. The crescent, the small star, hers, on a document that was older than the council that had ruined her name with it. What does this mean? She asked. Practically, what does it actually mean for me? He was quiet for a moment before he answered, and she recognized it as the kind of quiet that means someone is being careful to be honest. It means the life you have been living was built on a lie. It means you have rank that was taken from you before you could claim it. It means that by the laws of my bloodline, you are owed recognition. He held her gaze, and it means that if you choose it, you have a place that has nothing to do with water barrels and council floors. She breathed in slowly. She breathed out. You said if I choose it, she said. Yes. So I have a choice. Yes. She tilted her head slightly. The elders outside this room are going to say otherwise. Something changed in his expression, very slightly, in the direction of steel. The elders outside this room, he said quietly, are not the authority here. She believed him. That was the strange thing. She had been lied to enough times to have developed a good sense for the quality of a statement, the difference between something said to manage her and something said because it was true. This felt like the second kind. She looked at the document one more time. Then she pushed it back across the table toward him. Tell me what you know about the Lunaris mark, she said. All of it, not just the part that concerns my situation. Everything. He looked at her for a long moment, and the almost smile returned, slightly less almost this time. That, he said, will take a while. I have nowhere else to be, she said. He reached back into his coat and produced 2 more folded papers, and he began to talk. The council found out by mid-morning. Sarah was not surprised. Ashvale was a village. Ashvale was a village where Sarah was involved, which meant that people noticed what she did and talked about it in the pointed way of people who had long since decided what she was and did not enjoy having that decision complicated. She had been inside the council hall for 3 hours. People had been circling the building for 2 of those hours. By the time Elder Croft opened the door without knocking, Sarah had learned more about Lycan history in one sitting than she had in 20 years of secret reading. Croft stopped in the doorway. He looked at Sarah first, sitting across the table from the king, papers spread between them, her sleeve pushed back, her posture straight. Then he looked at the king. My apologies for the interruption, Croft said, in the tone of a man who was not apologizing at all. My king, I wanted to ensure our guest had everything he needed. I was not aware that. I had not sent for you, Cale said. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. Croft stopped talking. I would like to understand something, Cale said. He folded the papers on the table in front of him, slowly, and looked at the elder. This mark, he gestured toward Sarah's wrist. How long has it been visible on this woman? Since birth, Croft said. It is a deformity of the... It is a Lunaris mark, Cale said. My general confirmed it last night using documents from the Royal Archive. I would like you to explain to me how a sitting council in a village, with access to the regional library system, failed to identify it correctly. The silence that followed had a specific texture. Sarah had spent 20 years listening to silences in Ashvale, and she knew the difference between a silence that was empty and a silence that was full. This one was full of a lot of things. Calculation, fear, the particular shame of being caught at something you had convinced yourself was not wrong. Ancient texts can be difficult to interpret, Croft said. We had no reason to believe. You had a child with a visible mark and no source document to support the declaration you made about her. Cale's voice was still even. which was somehow worse than if it had risen. You made that declaration anyway, and then you built 20 years of this woman's life on top of it. Croft's jaw worked. The girl has been cared for. She has had shelter, food. She has been made to carry water and scrub floors for a village that told her she was cursed, Cale said. Do not make the mistake of calling that care. Croft looked at Sarah. She recognized the look. It was the look of a man who needed someone to be smaller so he could feel larger, and she was not performing that service right now, and he did not know what to do about that. My king, Croft said, trying a different approach. I understand your concern. But the girl, her name, Cale said, is Sarah. Croft closed his mouth. You will gather the full council, Cale said. I will address them this afternoon. Until then, Sarah will remain here, and will not be given tasks or instructions by any member of this village. He looked at Sarah briefly, just a glance, but it carried something in it that she recognized as acknowledgement. Then he looked back at Croft. You may go. Croft went. He moved with the controlled stiffness of a man holding himself together through the force of his own pride, and the door closed behind him with a precise click that tried very hard to be something other than what it was. Sarah let out a slow breath. He is going to be difficult, she said. Yes, Cale agreed. Are you all right? She looked at him. I have been managing people like Croft since I was 11 years old, she said. I am fine. He nodded, and she could see that he accepted this, rather than arguing with it, which was another thing that was different from what she was used to. Most people who asked if she was all right were really asking her to reassure them. What happens this afternoon? She asked. I speak to the council. He began gathering the papers, stacking them carefully. I document what has occurred here. I make certain decisions about how Ashvale's leadership will change. And me? He paused. He looked at her directly, and his pale gray eyes were steady. You have choices to make, he said. I do not want to make them for you. I want you to understand what they are, and then I want to hear what you decide. Sarah was quiet for a moment. She was thinking about something Croft had said once, years ago, in a conversation she had overheard through a wall. He had said, speaking of her, that she had an unfortunate habit of thinking, as though thinking were a problem, as though the ability to consider a situation were a flaw in a person who was supposed to simply accept. She had stored that comment in the same place she stored everything useful. She had taken it out often. It had kept her company on a lot of quiet evenings. Tell me the choices, she said. You can stay in Ashvale, he said. I will make sure changes are made here before I leave. Your status will be formally corrected. You will have rank, freedom, and the ability to make your own life in this village, without anyone using your mark against you. She nodded once. And? You can come with me to the Citadel. He said it simply, without pressure or performance. Your mark places you within the scope of royal recognition. You would be acknowledged there. You would have access to resources, to education, to a position that reflects what your mark actually means. A pause. The decision is yours. She thought about Ashvale. She thought about the faces of the people here. Faces she had known all her life. Faces that looked at her with that particular mix of familiarity, and something just slightly less than respect. She thought about her room with the east window. She thought about her mother's blanket. She thought about 20 years of being useful to people who did not value her. Then she thought about the document on the table, the drawing of her mark in writing older than this village, the quiet assurance in the voice of a man who had walked into Ashvale and chosen to ask her name and mean it. What happens, she said, if I come with you and it turns out to be another version of this? He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, That is a fair question. I cannot prove to you in advance that it will not be. I can tell you that I brought you a dress in your size and said please. A brief pause. That is a limited sample. She almost laughed. She did not, but it was close, and she thought the not-quite smile on his face meant he had noticed. All right, she said. She looked at the papers in his hands, the documents that contained the history of a mark she had been told was a shame, and had turned out to be something else entirely. I will hear the council meeting. And after? After, she said. I will decide. He nodded and said nothing more, and she appreciated that too. The not pressing. The leaving of space for her to be a person with a process rather than a problem to be solved. The afternoon came slowly, the way afternoons do when something important is waiting in them. The council hall filled with Ashvale's 7 elders and the 4 sub-elders who assisted them. Cale's general stood at the door. Cale stood at the front of the room and spoke for exactly as long as necessary, and no longer. Sarah sat along the wall. She had never sat in a council session as anything other than staff. She watched the faces of the elders while Cale spoke. She watched Croft go pale, and then red, and then pale again. She watched Fenwick, who had always been the most conflicted of them, look at her once with an expression she had not expected, something close to guilt. She filed that away too. When Cale finished speaking, the council hall was very quiet. 2 of the elder seats were formally suspended. Croft kept his title but lost his authority over certain decisions, which was, Sarah thought, probably more humiliating to him than any other consequence could have been. Then Cale turned to Sarah, in front of all of them, and he said, "I leave the day after tomorrow. Whatever you choose, I want you to know that your name has been corrected in this village's records today. That is done regardless of anything else." She looked at the elders. She looked at their faces. She looked at Fenwick, who was still watching her, and she saw in him, not an ally, but a person who might, given years and the right conditions, become someone capable of fairness. She looked at the east window of her room in her mind, the sunrise, the single shelf of books, the blanket. Then she looked at the king, and she said, "I would like to see the citadel." No one in the room said anything, but she heard the sound of the village's assumptions shifting around her, cracking along lines that had always been thin. She stood up from her chair along the wall, which was a chair she had carried in for others to sit in, and she walked to where Cale was standing, and she stood there, as though she had always had the right to stand in the front of rooms. Because it turned out that she had. She just had not been told. The ride from Ashvale to the Lycan citadel took 3 days. Sarah had never been more than 6 miles from the village in her entire life. She knew this because she had measured it once, on a day when the need to know the limit of her world was so strong that she had counted her steps north along the Highland Road until the path curved and the village disappeared behind the hill, and she had stood there for a long time, looking at the road ahead before turning back. 11,000 steps, 6 miles, the edge of everything she had ever known. Now she was watching that edge disappear behind her, and the road ahead was longer than she could see, and she was sitting in a small, well-made carriage that the king's general had arranged for her, with a wool blanket across her knees and a book she had been given from Cale's travel case open in her lap, and she was not crying, but she was holding very still in the way of someone who is feeling many things at once and has not yet decided which one to start with. She had taken 3 items from her room: the blanket her mother had made, the small piece of mirror, and the book she had been reading the night the king arrived. She had left the rest. Most of it was not truly hers anyway. The countryside moved past the carriage window in colors she had seen before, but never from motion. The dark green of highland grass, and the gray-silver of granite outcrops, and the occasional bright thread of a stream running down from somewhere higher. She watched it with the focused attention of someone who intended to remember. The king rode outside. She could see him when she looked through the window at an angle, a figure on the black horse, his coat replaced with traveling clothes but his posture exactly the same. She thought about posture, the way certain people carried themselves as though the space around them naturally belonged to them, and wondered whether that was something you were born with or something you built. She supposed she would find out. On the first evening, they stopped at a settlement large enough to have a road in. Sarah was given a room. Not a room she shared with the luggage. A room with a bed and a window, and a real fire in a small hearth. She sat in the chair by the fire for a long time before she got into the bed, partly because she was not yet accustomed to the idea of simply resting, when rest was available, and partly because she wanted to think. She thought about the Lunaris mark. She had read everything Cale had given her, and then she had asked him questions during the 2 hours they had traveled in the same carriage before he moved to his horse, and he had answered them with a directness she appreciated. The mark was ancient. It appeared in lineage texts going back 600 years. It had been associated with 3 Lycan queens in recorded history, each of whom had carried it. The last recorded appearance had been 4 generations ago, in a woman named Mira, who had bonded to a Lycan king and ruled beside him for 40 years. After that, the text noted the mark had not appeared again, until now. Sarah turned this over in the dark, listening to the fire settle. She was not naive. She understood that arriving at the citadel as a woman, with a mark that supposedly connected her to the king's bloodline, was not the same as arriving as someone wanted or welcomed. Courts had politics. Powers had people who preferred things as they were. She had survived 20 years in a village that preferred her small. She was not afraid of people who preferred things a certain way. She was, if she was honest with herself, a little afraid of hope. Hope was the thing that had always cost her the most. It was easier not to want things when you knew they would not come. She had managed that very well for many years. But somewhere between the king asking her name like it mattered, and the document on the table with the drawing of her mark, and the green dress that fit her, and the word please, somewhere in all of that, hope had crept back in, and now she was carrying it through unfamiliar country, toward an unknown future, and the weight of it was enormous and light at the same time. She fell asleep in the chair by the fire and woke when the fire had gone to embers, and she moved to the bed, and she slept better than she had in years. The second day, the land changed. The highlands gave way to rolling territory, lower and broader, with more trees and less sky. The road improved. They passed through 2 villages that were larger than Ashvale, and a town that was larger than both combined, and at each place people stopped to watch the convoy pass, and Sarah watched back from her carriage window, cataloging everything she could see. In the early afternoon, Cale rode alongside the carriage. He knocked on the frame of the window, which she thought was an interesting thing for a king to do when he could simply open it, and she opened it. "How are you finding the journey?" he asked. "Informative," she said. She meant it as a plain answer, but it came out sounding wry, which she had not intended. "Informative," he repeated, and the almost smile happened again. "Is there anything you need?" "More paper," she said. "I have been writing down observations, and I have used the margins of the book you gave me, which I apologize for." He blinked once. Then he reached into the bag attached to his saddle and produced a small notebook and passed it through the window without comment. She took it. "Thank you." He rode beside the carriage for a while longer, not speaking, which she did not find uncomfortable. She wrote in the notebook. She glanced at him occasionally. He was looking at the road ahead with the same expression he wore for most things, the settled, inward expression of someone who was always processing something. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Yes." "When you saw me by the water path, before you knew about the mark," she kept her voice even, "why did you stop?" He was quiet for a moment. When he answered, it was carefully honest, the way he seemed to prefer. "Because you did not look away," he said. "Everyone looks away. You did not." She considered this. "That was not bravery," she said. "I was startled." "Maybe," he said, "but you stayed startled in a very particular way." She did not have an answer for that, so she wrote another observation in her notebook instead. The third day, they crested a long, gradual hill in the late afternoon, and the Lycan citadel came into view. Sarah had read descriptions of it. She had read the chronicles and the histories and the small passages in geographical texts that mentioned it in passing. None of them had done an adequate job. It was built into the face of a mountain, not at the base but part way up, as though the mountain had grown around it, rather than the citadel being placed there by human hands. The stone was dark, nearly black in the afternoon shadow, but the parts that caught the sun were warm and almost amber. It was enormous. She had known it was large, but knowing a thing and seeing it were separate experiences entirely. Towers rose at intervals along its walls, and at the highest point, above the main structure, a single great window faced outward, and even from this distance, she could see the light behind it. She pressed her hand against the carriage window frame and looked at it for a long time. Cale's horse came alongside again. "First view," he said. "Not a question." "It is real," she said, which was not quite what she meant, but was close enough. "It is," he agreed. They rode down into the valley and up again toward the citadel's main approach, a wide stone road lined with old trees whose branches met overhead, making a tunnel of shadow and then light, shadow and then light, until they came through the great gate, and the citadel opened around them, and she stepped out of the carriage and stood in the outer courtyard with her small bag and her mother's blanket, and looked up at walls that had stood for centuries. People were moving through the courtyard, staff and guards and figures in official clothing, and they looked at the convoy with the rehearsed attention of people accustomed to the king's returns. Then they looked at Sarah, and the attention shifted to a different kind, curious, assessing. Not unkind, most of it, but concentrated, the way attention always concentrated on her in new places. She straightened her back. She kept her chin level. A woman came forward, tall and efficiently dressed, with dark brown hair pulled back and quick gray eyes. She stopped before Cale, gave a short bow, and then looked at Sarah directly. "This is Nora," Cale said. "She runs the household staff and knows everything about how this building works. She will get you settled." Nora looked at Sarah with an expression that was professionally neutral, but not unfriendly. "Welcome," she said. "I will show you your rooms." Rooms. The word was plural, and Sarah noticed. She followed Nora through corridors of stone and carpeting, and light from high windows, past doors and stairs, and the smell of old wood and cooking from somewhere deep in the building. She noted every turning. She counted steps. The rooms were on the east side of the Citadel's second level. There were two of them, connected by a short hall. The larger one had a desk and shelves already lined with books, empty shelves waiting, and a window that faced the valley they had ridden through. The smaller one had a bed and a wardrobe and its own fire. Sarah stood in the middle of the larger room and turned slowly. "The books are for your use," Nora said, gesturing at the waiting shelves. "The king said you prefer to read. If there are subjects you want that are not in the library, you can put in a request." A brief pause. "There is a library," she added, apparently judging from Sarah's expression that this was worth clarifying. "A large one?" Sarah asked. "One of the largest in the region," Nora said. Sarah turned to face the window. The valley was turning gold in the late afternoon light, and the sky above it was the pale, particular blue of early evening, the color that exists for only a few minutes before it deepens into something else. "Is there anything you need tonight?" Nora asked. "No," Sarah said. Then, remembering, "Thank you," Nora left. Sarah stood at the window for a long time. Then she opened her bag and took out the wool blanket and set it on the bed, and the small mirror and set it on the desk. And then she took out her book with the filled margins and the new notebook and set them beside it. She sat in the chair at the desk. She opened the notebook. She wrote, "Day 3. The Citadel is real. The window faces east." She paused and then added, "I do not know yet what this is, but it is more than I had." She closed the notebook. Outside, the valley went quiet and golden, and then slowly, gently dark. She had arrived. That was the beginning of the next thing, and she did not know what the next thing was, but she was here, and she was herself, and the mark on her wrist was not a curse, and for tonight, that was enough. Someone had left flowers in the corridor outside her room. Not many, just a small bunch tied with plain string, and left against the wall near her door. Purple and white, and slightly formal in the way that flowers are when someone is trying to be welcoming, but is not quite sure of the right gesture. Sarah noticed them when she came out in the morning for the first time, and stopped and looked at them for a moment, before deciding she liked them, even if she did not know who had left them. She had slept a full night. She could not remember the last time that had happened, because in Ashvale, the water barrels needed filling at dawn, and the council hall needed sweeping before the elders arrived, and her body had been trained by years of early rising into waking, before she was finished with sleep. But last night no one had needed anything from her, and the bed was better than she was used to, and the room was quiet in the particular way of thick stone walls, and she had woken when the light changed and not before. She dressed in the simplest of the clothes that had been placed in the wardrobe, which were all plainer than the green dress, but finer than anything she had owned, and she went looking for the library. She found it by asking a young staff member who looked startled to be asked something by her, and then gave extremely clear directions. The library was on the 3rd level, 2 long corridors and a wide staircase away, and it was, as Nora had said, very large. Sarah stood in the doorway for a moment, taking it in. The room was 2 stories tall, with shelves that ran floor to ceiling and a gallery level accessible by a wooden staircase, and the morning light came in through 3 tall windows and lay across the reading tables in long, pale bars. The smell of it was the smell of old paper and binding material, and the particular dusty warmth of many books in a closed space, and it was one of the best smells she had ever encountered. She went in. She spent the first hour simply walking, reading spines, understanding the organization system, which was chronological within subject categories. She found the Lycan history section, which was 3 full rows on the ground level and half a row upstairs. She found the section on bloodline lore, and then the subsection on ancient markings and lineage signs, and she ran her finger along the spines until she found the oldest ones and pulled the first one out. She was sitting at one of the reading tables, 3 books open in front of her and notes accumulating in her notebook, when she became aware that she was not alone. She looked up. A woman stood at the end of the table. She was tall and dressed in the particular way of someone who was accustomed to being the best-dressed person in any room she entered, and she had dark hair and sharp features and eyes that were doing a very controlled version of something unfriendly. "You are the one from Ashvale," the woman said. It was not quite a question. "Yes," Sarah said. "I am Lady Vireth Calloway," the woman said. "I have been at court for 5 years. I was, until 3 days ago, the primary consideration for the position of the king's bonded." Sarah looked at her steadily. "I am Sarah," she said. "I know who you are," Vireth said. Her voice was controlled and smooth, the voice of someone who had practiced being controlled. "I wanted to see you for myself." Her gaze moved across Sarah, over the plain clothes, and the open books, and the notebook with its dense, small writing. "You are not what I expected." "What did you expect?" Sarah asked, with genuine curiosity. Vireth seemed briefly thrown by the question, as though she had expected a different kind of response. "Something more obvious," she said. "Something the king would have noticed before." "He noticed me because I happened to be in his path," Sarah said. "I have been told I have an unfortunate habit of not looking away when I should." The corner of Vireth's mouth moved. It was not warm, but it was complicated, which was more interesting than hostile would have been. "The mark," Vireth said. "You actually have it." "Yes. And you believe what he told you about it." Sarah looked at the books open on the table in front of her. "I am checking," she said. "I do not believe things because someone tells me to. I check." Vireth looked at the books. She looked at Sarah. Something in her expression shifted, not toward warmth, but toward a different kind of consideration. "Be careful," she said, and it was impossible to tell if it was a threat or an observation. She left. Sarah watched her go, filed the encounter away carefully, and returned to her reading. In the afternoon, a knock came on the library door. Nora opened it and said that the king was asking if she would like a tour of the citadel. Sarah closed her books. She followed Nora back through the corridors to the main hall, where Cale was waiting in the same comfortable, settled way he seemed to wait for everything, as though patience was something that simply existed in him, rather than something that required effort. The tour lasted 2 hours. There were training halls and conference rooms, and a great dining hall, and a smaller, older hall that was used for historical gatherings, and a map room that Sarah spent longer in than any other room, running her eyes over the topography of a world she had only known from the small corner of it she had occupied. Cale showed her things without presenting them. He explained what she asked about and did not offer information she had not requested. He walked slightly behind her rather than leading, which she noticed and thought about. When the tour was finished, they were standing in an internal courtyard, open to the sky, with a small garden that was still winter sparse, but showed the shapes of what it would be in a few months. "There is a council meeting tomorrow," Cale said. "Some of the noble representatives are in residence. They will know about you, if they do not already. I want to tell you that before you encounter them, so you are not surprised." She looked at him. "What do they know?" "That you arrived with me. That you carry the Lunaris mark. That you are from Ashvale." A pause. "That your situation before coming here was constrained." "Constrained," she said. "That is a polite way to put it." "I tend toward polite before I have reason to be otherwise," he said. She looked at the garden, at the dry, patient shape of it, waiting for spring. "Is Lady Vireth one of the noble representatives?" "She is," he said, and she could hear something careful in his voice. "She came to find me in the library this morning," Sarah said. "She looked at me the way people look at things they are not sure how to deal with." He was quiet for a moment. "I should have told you about her before today," he said. "That was an oversight. I apologize." She looked at him, a little surprised. Not at the apology's content, but at its directness, the lack of excuses wrapped around it. "It is all right," she said. "I have dealt with people who resent my existence before. This is different from Ashvale," he said. "Yes," she agreed. "In Ashvale, they had power over me. Here, they only have opinions." She looked back at the garden. Opinions I can manage. He looked at her for a long moment. There will be a formal gathering, the night after the council meeting, he said. I would like you to attend. She considered. As what? As yourself, he said. As someone who is here, and has every right to be. All right, she said. He did not say that it would be easy, or that it would not matter, or any of the things people say when they want to protect you from the truth about a difficult thing. He said all right, and she appreciated that more than reassurance. She went back to the library. She read until the light failed. Then she went to her room, and sat at the desk, and wrote in her notebook. She wrote, I am not afraid. I should be more afraid than I am. I think the absence of fear is not because I do not understand the situation. I think it is because I am used to navigating situations with nothing at my back. At least here, if something is coming for me, it will have to cross a library first. She looked at what she had written. Then she added, and this time, I will be the one holding the books. The night of the gathering arrived with the particular slowness of events you have been told to prepare for. Nora had arrived the previous afternoon, with 3 women, who worked with clothing, and 2 hours of conversation about what Sarah should wear, which was the longest anyone had spent considering her appearance, in a way that was for her benefit, rather than for the benefit of how she would reflect on others. Sarah had sat in the chair by the window and answered their questions, and made a few preferences clear, and mostly watched the process with the alert attention of someone gathering information about a new world. The result was a dress in deep blue-gray, the color of the sky at the specific moment, before night fully commits to itself. It was simply cut, but the material was good, and it did not try to make her into something she was not. It let her be herself in a dress worth wearing, which was what she had wanted. She was not nervous. This surprised her slightly. She had expected to be, had prepared arguments against it, and then found the arguments were unnecessary. She looked in the small mirror she had brought from Ashvale, and saw the same face she always saw, the same dark eyes that did not look away from things they should probably look away from. She did not look like someone who belonged in a Citadel gathering. She also did not look like someone who did not. She tucked one piece of hair behind her ear. She did not cover the mark on her wrist. She went. The gathering hall was the old one she had seen on the tour, lower ceilinged than the Great Hall, with dark wood paneling and candlelight from iron holders along the walls. It held perhaps 80 people when she arrived, and the sound of it was the particular sound of well-dressed people talking to each other about things that mattered to them, the murmur of consequence. She entered without announcement. She had asked Nora specifically not to announce her, because entering a room unannounced gave her a few moments to look at it before it looked at her, and those moments were useful. She took a cup of something warm from a passing server. She moved along the edge of the room, watching. She identified Virith immediately, at the center of a small group, wearing dark red, moving her hands when she spoke the way people do when they are accustomed to being listened to. She identified Kale's general, Owen, standing near the windows in conversation with 2 older men. She identified several faces she recognized from the council meeting she had been allowed to observe the previous day. Then she identified Kale. He was across the room, speaking with a group of 4 people, and he was doing what she had noticed he always did in these settings, which was giving whoever was talking to him his complete attention, in a way that made them feel like the only person in the room, which was a very specific skill. He had changed into formal clothes, darker than his usual traveling wear, and he looked like what he was, which was the most powerful person in the room. He looked across the room and found her. She had not realized she was looking at him with any particular expression until she felt the expression change when their eyes met, a small internal shift that she catalogued and did not examine yet. He gave her the briefest of nods, not a command or a summons, just an acknowledgement. She nodded back. Then someone spoke beside her. "You are braver than I thought." She turned. A man her own age was standing at her elbow, not close enough to be intrusive, but close enough to have clearly approached on purpose. He had a pleasant face and brown eyes, and an expression of friendly assessment. "I am not sure I am being brave," she said. "I am just standing here. In this room, for you, right now. That is brave," he said. He held out his hand. "I am Edmund Hale. I am one of the junior representatives from the Eastern House, which means I am not important enough for anyone to worry about what I say, which is its own kind of freedom." She shook his hand. "Sarah," she said. "I know," he said. Everyone knows. Half of them are trying to look like they are not looking at you right now. He glanced around the room with no particular subtlety. I decided that was stupid, so I came over directly. I appreciate that, she said. Can I tell you something that might be useful? He asked. Yes. The ones who are going to be most difficult for you are not the ones who seem hostile tonight, he said. The hostile ones are honest about what they are. The difficult ones are the ones who seem perfectly friendly and are quietly working out how to be a problem later. He sipped from his cup. In my experience anyway. She looked around the room. Lady Vireth? Oh, she is hostile and working out how to be a problem, he said. She is efficient like that. I am talking about the ones who seem charmed to meet you. He smiled. Keep your notebook handy. She almost laughed. She did not, but the almost was genuine. Thank you, Edmund Hale, she said. Anytime, he said. It is good to have someone new here who reads things. He nodded toward the far wall and moved off, comfortable and unhurried, back into the current of the room. Sarah stood with her cup and her observations, and thought about what he had said. Then she moved further into the room, slowly, because moving was better than being cornered, and she was very good at moving through spaces while appearing to simply be going somewhere. She met 11 people in the next hour. She was introduced to 7, and introduced herself to 4. She was pleasant without being warm, which was a calibration she had learned in Ashvale, and found worked in every room that contained people who were trying to work out her value. She gave her name. She answered questions with other questions when the questions were pointed. She listened more than she spoke. One of the older representatives, a man named Aldous Crane, had spent 15 minutes asking her questions about Ashvale's relationship to the regional pack structure that were polite on the surface and pointed underneath, and she had answered each one with information that was accurate and gave nothing unnecessary away, and by the end of the exchange, he had looked at her with an expression that was grudgingly respectful, which she filed carefully. At some point in the second hour, Vireth appeared beside her. She had been expecting this. She had been watching for it. You handled Aldous Crane well, Vireth said. He asked about Ashvale's relationship to the Royal Council, Sarah said. I told him the truth, which was that I was not part of the council and had limited knowledge of the administrative relationship. He seemed to prefer that to something invented. Most people would have invented something, Vireth said. Most people are afraid of being caught knowing nothing, Sarah said. I have been told I know nothing for 20 years. The accusation has lost its impact. Vireth looked at her, looked properly, the way she had in the library, with that complicated something in her eyes. You are not what I expected, she said again. The same words as the library. You said that already, Sarah said. I know. Vireth looked toward Cale, across the room. He is not easy to understand, she said. I have been here 5 years, and I do not always understand him. Sarah followed her gaze. I do not need to understand someone to trust them, she said. I need to see what they do, when it costs them something. Vireth was quiet for a moment. And what have you seen? He corrected my record in front of the people who created it, she said. That cost him a comfortable afternoon. It was not nothing. Vireth said nothing. Sarah looked at her. I am not your enemy, Sarah said. It was not an offer of friendship, it was a statement of position. I am not here to take something from you. I did not choose to be born with this mark, and I did not choose to end up here. But I am here now, and I intend to take it seriously. Vireth looked at her for a long moment. Then she said, That is either very foolish or very confident. Probably both, Sarah said. And that was not quite a smile on Vireth's face, but it was something close to it, and it was more interesting than the controlled unfriendliness had been. Vireth moved away. Sarah watched her go. Then she felt a presence nearby and looked up. Cale had crossed the room and was standing a comfortable distance from her, the gathering continuing around them. You have been busy, he said. I have been learning, she said. It is the same thing, for me. He looked at her for a moment. How are you finding it? The same as always, she said. People are predictable until they are not, and then they are the most interesting thing in the room. She glanced around. Edmund Hale is useful. Aldous Crane is cautious but fair. The woman in green near the door has not spoken to anyone directly, and I do not know what that means yet. He followed her glance toward the woman in green. That is Lady Oakes, he said. She has not spoken to anyone directly, at any gathering in 3 years. Her husband died at one of these events. She still comes, but she stays quiet. Sarah looked at him. That is sad. It is, he agreed. There was no performance in the way he said it, just acknowledgement. She looked at the room, at the candles and the people and the low hum of consequence, and she thought that she was still learning all of this, still reading the spines without having opened the books yet. But she was here, and she was herself, and the mark on her wrist was uncovered, and that felt like a beginning. "Thank you for inviting me tonight," she said. "Thank you for coming," he said. A pause. "Was it?" "Yes," she said. "I am all right." She looked up at him, and he was looking at her in that steady way that made her feel like something worth looking at. "More than all right," she said. He stayed beside her for a while, and when he was pulled back into conversations with others, she remained where she was, and watched and learned and catalogued, and the candles burned low and the evening settled around her, and she was, she realized, somewhere in the middle of belonging, which was a feeling she did not have a name for yet but intended to keep. She had expected the court to be uniformly hostile or uniformly cold. What she found instead was far more complicated and far more interesting. It was a place made of people, and people were never uniform about anything. Some were curious. Some were protective of what they already had. Some were genuinely kind. Some were waiting to decide. She could work with that. She had been working with complicated rooms her entire life. She had just never before been in one where she was allowed to sit down. She took a final cup of tea from a server near the end of the evening and stood near the window where the air was slightly cooler and looked out at the dark courtyard below, and she thought about tomorrow, and the day after, and the months of days after that, and for the first time in a very long time, she did not think about those days with the contracted, careful feeling of someone bracing for more of the same. She thought about them the way you think about a road you have just started to walk, with interest, with the reasonable confidence of someone who has good shoes and enough food and knows how to read a map, with, somewhere underneath all of that, something she was still just barely willing to call hope. Spring arrived at the Citadel in the way of things that have been waiting politely. One morning there was frost on the garden stones, and the next morning there was not, and after that the air changed and the bare shapes in the courtyard garden began to carry small green promises along their branches. Sarah noticed all of it from her east-facing window, and from the courtyard itself, where she had taken to walking in the early hours before the building fully woke, the time that felt most like her own. She had been at the Citadel for 8 weeks. 8 weeks was long enough to begin to know a place, to understand its patterns, and its people, and the way it moved through a day. She had made a map of it in her notebook, not just the rooms but the rhythms, who walked which corridors at which times, where the quiet was and where the busy was, and how to find either, depending on what she needed. She had learned many things. She had learned that Owen, the general, was the most organized person she had ever met, and the only person at the Citadel who kept a filing system more detailed than her own notes. She had learned that Edmund Hale arrived at the library at almost exactly the same time every other morning, and could be relied upon for dry observations about court life. She had learned that Nora ran the Citadel's household with the quiet authority of someone who had been doing it long enough that her systems worked, even when she was not watching. She had learned, gradually and through observation, that the court's initial interest in her had settled into something more complicated. Not hostile, mostly. Not fully welcoming either. She was too new, and too different, and too outside the established categories for anyone to have decided simply what she was yet. She used that uncertainty. She kept her notebook. She kept reading. She had also been learning about Cale Draven. Not intentionally, at first. But he was the center of the place she was in, and learning about a place meant learning about its center, and so she learned. She learned that he was in the map room before sunrise on days when decisions were difficult. She learned that he ate very little at formal meals, and considerably more at informal ones. She learned that he read history in the evenings, specifically military history, and that the margins of his books were as full as hers, though his notes were shorter and more pointed. She learned, through Owen who had mentioned it without quite meaning to, that Cale had not slept well in years, that he had been running the kingdom since he was 19, when his father died in a territorial conflict, and that the weight of it had accumulated over time, in ways that an outsider would not easily see, but that were there, if you knew how to look. She was learning how to look. On a morning in the 5th week, she had come to the map room early, not knowing he would be there, and found him standing at the large central table, with 3 maps open, and a cup of cold tea forgotten at the edge. He had looked up when she entered, and she had said she would come back, and he had said no, come in if you want, and she had come in, and they had spent 2 hours at the table while she asked questions about the maps and he answered them, and it was the most natural thing she had done since arriving. After that, the map room had become a place she went sometimes, and sometimes he was there, and sometimes he was not, and when he was there they talked, and when he was not, she used the maps alone, which was also good. On a particular afternoon in the 7th week, she was sitting with Edmund in the library. He had brought 2 cups from the kitchen, which he did sometimes without being asked, and she had accepted hers the way she accepted all small gestures that were genuinely offered, directly and without making a thing of it. "The court has made up its mind about you," Edmund said. He was looking at his cup rather than at her, which was his way when he was saying something he thought might be uncomfortable. "What has it decided?" she asked. "Most of it thinks you are serious," he said, "which means most of it does not know what to do with you. Serious people from Ashvale are not a category anyone had prepared for." She almost smiled. "And the rest?" "The rest are waiting," he said. "There is a group, not large but connected, that is still watching to see what the king does. As long as he treats the situation carefully, they will be careful too, the moment anything changes." He shrugged. "Virith is part of that group," Sarah said. "Virith is the center of it," he said. "She is smarter than most of them, and she is patient, which is a more dangerous combination than anger." He looked at her finally. "You should know that she is asking questions. About Ashvale. About your history there." Sarah was quiet for a moment, processing that. "Who is she asking?" "Anyone with a connection to the Highlands," he said. "The clerk who manages correspondence with the northern packs. 2 representatives from the mountain territories." He paused. "I do not know what she is looking for, but she is looking." Sarah thought about what could be found in Ashvale. She thought about the records, about what the council might put in writing if asked the right questions by someone with the right authority. She thought about the sub-elders, some of whom had never liked her, and all of whom had their own accounts of her years there. "Thank you for telling me," she said. Edmund nodded. He did not tell her not to worry, which she appreciated. He had given her information, because she was someone who could use it, and that was the right thing to do. She went to the library that evening, and read about bond legitimacy law for 3 hours. It was not pleasant reading, being the kind of legal text that was dense and heavily qualified, but she worked through it steadily, making notes, understanding the structure of what could be challenged and under what circumstances, and what the process for such a challenge would look like. When she came out of the library at the end of the evening, she was tired, and her eyes ached from the candlelight, but she had a clearer picture of the legal landscape, and knowing the shape of a thing made it less threatening, which was something she had believed since she was a child. She went to her room and wrote in her notebook. She wrote, "Virith is patient. That means she will wait until she has something solid. I need to understand the ground before she makes her move." She paused and then wrote, "I am not afraid of her. I am paying attention to her, which is different." She closed the notebook. She sat at the east window for a while, looking at the dark valley and the stars above it. The next morning she went to the map room, and Cale was there, and she told him what Edmund had said. She did not dress the information up or soften it. She said simply that Edmund had told her Virith was asking questions about her history in Ashvale, and that she did not know what Virith was looking for, but that he should know. He was quiet for a moment, looking at the map on the table rather than at her. Then he said, "Thank you for telling me." "What do you know about what could be found?" she asked. He looked up. "The council's records from Ashvale are subject to royal review," he said. "They cannot be formally submitted to any legal challenge without going through Owen first. That gives us visibility before anything reaches a formal stage." She nodded. "And informally?" He held her gaze. "Informally, there are people who will say whatever benefits them most in a given moment. That is always the risk." He paused. "But you are not without documentation either. The medical examination can be arranged. The archive records are clear. The case for the mark's legitimacy is better than any case against it." She looked at the map in front of him. It was the Highland Territory, the region that contained Ashvale, marked with the pack territories and the roads and the elevations. She found Ashvale on it, a small mark among many, and she thought about how much of her life had been contained in that small mark, and how much larger the world was than that. "I am not worried about the case," she said. "I am prepared for the case. I am telling you, because you should know what is developing." He looked at her for a moment, and in his expression she saw something she had begun to recognize, something that sat underneath the usual steadiness. "You are always a step ahead," he said. "I have had a lot of practice thinking around corners," she said. "When you grow up in a place that does not want you, you learn to anticipate." He was quiet. The map room was quiet. Outside the window, the spring morning was doing what spring mornings do, which is insisting on existing with complete confidence. "For what it is worth," he said, after a moment, "this place wants you." She looked at him. She considered several responses and discarded them. Then she said, "That is still new. I am still learning what to do with it." He nodded, and he did not push further, which was the right thing to do, and she was aware of him doing the right thing, which she was increasingly aware of as a pattern, rather than a coincidence. She went back to her books. She kept her notes. She continued learning the Citadel and the people in it, the way she learned everything, with patience and care, and the quiet intention of someone who understands that knowledge is not just useful but protective, that the more you understand about a place, the less it can surprise you in the wrong direction. She had been surprised in the wrong direction enough times. She was not interested in being surprised that way again. She also had, somewhere in the middle of the 7th week, found a small project for herself that had nothing to do with politics, or the court, or the Lunaris mark, or any of it. She had gone deep into the library's older sections, the ones that were catalogued loosely and not well, and she had started to create a proper index for them. She did not tell anyone. She simply did it in the early mornings before anyone else arrived, sitting cross-legged on the floor between shelves, pulling out books and writing their details into a notebook she had set aside for this specific purpose. She did it because she liked it, because the order she was creating was useful and would outlast her, and had nothing to do with being watched or tested or evaluated, because it was hers to do. The library itself seemed to appreciate the attention, or perhaps she was simply comfortable enough now to feel comfortable in it, which amounted to the same thing. She was in the old section, halfway through the 3rd row of an uncatalogued shelf, when Edmund arrived one morning and found her, and stood at the end of the row with his 2 cups, and looked at her on the floor, surrounded by books, with an expression that she had come to recognize as genuine warmth. "This is what you do with your early mornings," he said. "The catalog has not been updated in 60 years, she said. "It was bothering me." He set her cup on the nearest flat surface within reach, which was the top of a history of Highland settlements from 3 centuries ago, and sat down in the chair at the reading table and looked at her. "Tell me when you are done with that row," he said. "I will bring more tea." She looked at him. "You do not have to help." "I know," he said. "That is why I am offering." She went back to the shelf. He drank his tea and read something from his own bag and did not disturb her, and it was one of the more comfortable mornings she had had at the Citadel, which said something about both of them. She paid attention to the court around her, with the steady, quiet attention she brought to everything that mattered. And she waited for Vareth to make her move. The trouble, when it finally arrived in its proper form, arrived on a Tuesday, which seemed too ordinary a day for the shape of what it brought. Sarah had been at the Citadel for nearly 3 months. She knew the corridors well enough to walk them without thinking. She knew the library's organization well enough to find what she was looking for without scanning every shelf. She knew Owen's schedule, and Nora's routes, and Edmund's reading habits, and the guard rotation, and where the best light came through, which windows, at which times of day. She knew the Citadel the way she had always learned places, thoroughly and quietly and from the inside out. She also knew the court's patterns, and in those patterns she had noticed, over the past 2 weeks, a particular kind of increased activity. Small things. Conversations that stopped when she entered a room. A cluster of the older noble representatives near the East Wing one afternoon, dispersing quickly when she appeared. Owen looking at her with an expression she had learned to read as protective concern, which was different from his usual businesslike regard. She had not asked anyone what was happening. She had waited, because she had learned that patience extracted more information than questions, and because she had learned to trust her own ability to read a situation given enough time. On the Tuesday in question, the information came to her. She was in the lower corridor near the council wing, returning from the map room with a reference she had borrowed, when she heard Vyreth's voice through a half-open door. She did not stop walking. She slowed, slightly, enough to hear the words. "The precedent is clear," Vyreth was saying. "The law has not changed. Any noble of standing may challenge the legitimacy of a proposed bond before the formal ceremony takes place." Another voice, a man's, older, careful. "The king will not receive this well. The king is bound by the same laws as the rest of us," Vyreth said. "That is the point of the law. If the mark is genuine, the challenge will fail, and the matter is closed. If there is any question, you have a witness. I have too," Vyreth said. "From Ashvale. They have confirmed in writing that the mark was added artificially." The door was pulled wider by someone inside, and Sarah kept walking, maintained her pace, turned the corner, and stood in the empty adjoining corridor for exactly 30 seconds, while she processed what she had heard. Vyreth had found people in Ashvale, people who were willing to sign documents claiming her mark was artificial, claiming it had been put on her, not born on her. She knew exactly who they would be. She could name them without thinking. Sub-elders who had little to lose and old resentments to spend. People who had watched her work for 20 years and had never liked the quiet way she watched them back. She breathed in. She breathed out. She walked to the library. She spent 2 hours pulling every document she could find on the Lunaris mark, the legal frameworks surrounding bond challenges, and the specific precedents related to legitimacy disputes. She built a stack of 12 documents. She made notes in the margins of a fresh notebook page. She read quickly and precisely, the way she had always read when she needed information to be useful rather than interesting. She found 3 precedents where challenges had been filed and failed. She found one where a challenge had succeeded, based on testimony that was later found to be falsified, and she noted that case carefully, because it contained the legal language surrounding false testimony to the Crown, which was a separate matter from the challenge itself, and carried its own consequences. Then she went to find Owen. He was in his office, the most organized room in the Citadel after the library, and when she knocked and entered, he looked at her with the expression she had identified as protective concern, and did not look surprised to see her. "You know," he said. "I heard enough," she said. She sat down without being invited, which she had learned Owen did not mind. She put the stack of documents on his desk. "What do I need to understand about the challenge process?" He looked at the documents. He looked at her. "It goes before a court," he said, "not a judge. The noble representatives. They hear both sides. They decide. How many are needed to clear it?" 2/3, he said, in favor of dismissal. She did the mathematics of the faces she knew. "That is workable," she said. He looked at her carefully. "The witnesses from Ashvale have signed testimony." "I know," she said. "They are lying. I need to be able to demonstrate that." She opened the top document. "Tell me about the medical examination process. If my mark is genuine, it can be confirmed?" Owen was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "There is a method. It requires a physician with knowledge of old bloodline markings, and it requires the king's presence, because the mark responds to the presence of the relevant bloodline." He paused. "It would make the argument for you without needing to argue." She looked at him. "Does Kale know about the challenge?" "Not yet. Vyreth filed it this morning. He will be informed this afternoon." "I see," she said. She stacked the documents neatly. "I want to be the one to tell him." Owen looked at her for a moment, and then he nodded. "I will give you an hour before the official notification reaches him." She stood. She picked up her documents. "Thank you." "You are taking this very calmly," Owen said. She stopped in the doorway and looked back at him. "I have been called impure since I was 3 days old, by people who had no idea what they were talking about," she said. "Vyreth is working with 2 people who will say what she needs them to say. That is not the first time someone has tried to define me with lies." She shifted the stack of documents in her arms. "I am not calm," she said. "I am focused. Those are different things." Owen looked at her with something in his face that was not just professional regard. "Good," he said. "Go." She found Kale in the map room, which was where she had expected to find him in the late afternoon. He was alone, standing at the large table with one hand flat on the map, looking at the Northern Territory lines. He looked up when she knocked and came in. She put the documents on the table. Virith has filed a bond legitimacy challenge, she said. She has 2 witnesses from Ashvale who have signed testimony claiming my mark was artificially applied. The challenge will go before the noble representatives. She filed this morning. She paused. You will receive official notification within the hour. I wanted to tell you myself. He was very still. The kind of still that she had learned was not absence of feeling, but the presence of a feeling being held very tightly. Are you all right? He asked. She blinked. She had not expected that to be the first thing he said. Yes, she said. I have a plan. Tell me, he said. She told him. She laid out the medical examination, the documentation she had gathered, the legal precedents, the structure of the argument. She spoke clearly and without flinching because she had spent 2 hours making certain she could do exactly that. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. You did all of this in 2 hours, he said. I had the research started, she said. I have been watching the patterns for 2 weeks. I knew something was coming. He looked at her, and his expression was the steady one, but underneath it, she could see something else, something that made her look away at the documents. The witnesses from Ashvale, he said. His voice was careful in the way of someone choosing not to let it be something else. They will be dealt with separately. That is a matter of false testimony to the Crown, which is serious. I know, she said. I looked up the penalty. It will not come to that if they retract, he said. Which they likely will, when they understand the situation properly. She nodded. She looked at the maps on the table, old and detailed, and spanning the full range of the known territory. She had learned to read them properly by now. Are you afraid? She asked. It was not a question she had planned to ask. It came out because it was the real question underneath the operational one. He looked at her for a moment. Of the challenge failing? Of any of it, she said. He was quiet for long enough that she knew he was actually thinking about it, rather than giving her a managed answer. I am afraid, he said, of doing harm, by moving too fast, or too slowly. Of getting the balance wrong between what the law requires and what the situation needs. A pause. I am not afraid of what the outcome of the challenge will be. The mark is genuine. That is a fact. Facts have a way of surviving. She looked at the documents on the table. At the fact of them, the pages of evidence she had gathered in 2 hours, the shape of a defense built from nothing but knowledge, and the focused application of it. They should not have tried to use Ashvale against me, she said, and she meant it quietly, without performance. Those people signed a document about my wrist. My wrist has been answering for itself since before any of them could read. He looked at her for a long moment. She felt the weight of that look, the specific quality of it that she had been cataloging and not annotating. The hearing is set for 3 days from now, he said. Use the time. I intend to, she said. She picked up her documents and she left the map room, and she walked back through the corridors of the Citadel, the corridors she knew now by feel and by memory, and she went to the library, and she sat at her table, and she lit her candle, and she began to prepare in earnest. She did not stop until midnight. When she finally closed the last document, she had built a case that she would have been satisfied to present in her own defense, even without the medical evidence. And with it she was more than satisfied. She was, to use the word Owen had offered her, focused. She blew out the candle. She walked to her room in the dark. She got into bed. She lay awake for exactly 1 hour, going over the argument one final time, and then she let it go, the way you let go of something you have finished. The work was done. The rest was the presentation of it. She slept. She woke at the normal time, and the morning was ordinary, and she went to the library and continued the archive catalog in the early hours as she always did, because the challenge was in 3 days, and the archive still needed cataloging, and both of those things were true at the same time, and she had learned long ago that ordinary work done in the middle of extraordinary circumstances was one of the most stabilizing things a person could do. Edmund arrived with 2 cups, and looked at the shelves she was cataloging, and said nothing for a while, just drank his tea, and then he said, I heard about the challenge. I expected that, she said. Are you? I am prepared, she said. He looked at her for a moment. Then he raised his cup slightly, a small and genuine gesture. She nodded once, and went back to the shelves. 3 days. She had 3 days, and a case that was solid, and a mark that was real, and 20 years of knowing that truth was the thing nobody could take away from her, no matter what they tried. She was ready. The hearing was held on a Thursday morning, in the Great Hall, which Sarah had never been in before. It was larger than the gathering hall, and older, its ceiling high enough that the winter daylight from the upper windows fell in long diagonal bars across the stone floor. The noble representatives sat in a curved arrangement along one side, 12 of them, in chairs that had clearly been here for a very long time. Owen stood near the side wall with his hands clasped, and his expression professionally blank, which she recognized as the face he wore when he was more concerned than he wanted to show. Edmund was in the observer seats along the back, and she had seen him come in and take his place, with the expression of a man who was there to watch closely, and would give his full account afterward. Virith sat on one side of the central space, composed and perfectly still, with 2 of her representatives standing behind her. Sarah sat on the other side. She had a table. On the table were 3 organized stacks of documents. Cale sat at the front of the room, in the chair reserved for the king at legal proceedings. He was not one of the 12 who would decide. He was, technically, a party in the challenge, as the bond in question was connected to him. He had told her, the evening before, that his being present was his choice, not a requirement, and that he would be there. He was there. Sarah looked at the 12 representatives and noted which ones she recognized, which ones had spoken to her at the gathering, which ones had been in the clusters she had observed over the past 2 weeks. She had prepared for each of them individually, had thought about what each one valued, and what kind of evidence would speak most clearly to each kind of mind. She had spent 3 days preparing, and the preparation had settled into her bones, in the way that real preparation does, quiet and solid and completely available. The senior representative, an older woman named Lady Morton who chaired the Noble Council, called the hearing to order. Virith went first. She was practiced and smooth, as Sarah had expected. She presented the challenge with the language of concern rather than accusation, framing it as a matter of due diligence, of the court's responsibility to ensure proper process before a formal bonding of this significance took place. She mentioned the unusual circumstances of the situation, the speed of the king's decision, the lack of prior court involvement. She spoke with the measured authority of someone who had been present at many such proceedings. Then the testimony from Ashvale was read aloud. 2 written statements from sub-elders of the village, both claiming to have personal knowledge that the mark on Sarah's wrist had been applied by an outside practitioner when Sarah was an infant, paid for by her mother, who had allegedly wanted her daughter to appear special to offset the stigma of low birth rank. The room was quiet while the statements were read. Sarah listened to every word. She had expected lies, but the specific shape of these surprised her briefly, the way a particular flavor of cruelty surprises you, even when you knew cruelty was coming. Then the surprise passed, and she set it aside, because there was no room for it in what she was about to do. She knew the names. Aldrich, who had always done what was convenient, and Peg, who had watched Sarah work for 20 years, with an expression Sarah had never quite been able to name but now could, looking back. She named them in her mind, and then she let them go too, because the hearing was not about them. When Virith finished, Lady Morton turned to Sarah. Sarah stood. "I would like to begin with the documentation," she said. She had asked Owen how formal she was required to be, and Owen had said as formal as feels right, and what felt right was direct, which was what she was. She walked the 12 representatives through the documents in order. The Lunaris mark in bloodline records, starting with the oldest. The 3 historical queens who had carried it, with the original descriptions preserved from each era. The physical description of the mark's specific features, which matched hers precisely in 6 different texts, from 6 different centuries. She gave each representative a copy of the key pages to hold. She had made the copies herself, carefully, the night before. She spent 20 minutes on the documentation. She did not rush. She let each person look at what they were looking at, and come to their own understanding of it, because people trusted conclusions they reached themselves, more than conclusions they were given. Then she turned to the medical question. "The testimony presented suggests the mark was applied externally," she said. "I would like to address this directly." She looked at Lady Morton. "A physician with knowledge of old bloodline markings examined me yesterday morning, at Owen's arrangement. The report is in the 3rd stack." She placed a document on the table, and walked it toward the nearest representative, so it could be passed along. "The mark shows characteristics consistent with a birth marking. It is deeply integrated with the skin's natural structure. in a way that applied markings do not achieve and cannot replicate. The specific medical details are noted with the physician's credentials attached. She paused. She let that settle. But I would like to demonstrate something more simply than documentation allows, she said. She looked at Cale. He was watching her with complete attention, as he always did in rooms where something mattered. The Lunaris mark responds to the presence of the relevant bloodline, she said. This is documented in 3 of the texts I have provided. The activation of the mark in the king's presence was described in the historical records of all 3 previous queens who carried it. Queen Mira's chronicle specifically records that witnesses observed it at her bonding ceremony. She held the document up briefly, then set it down. I would ask for the king's proximity, so the representatives can see it for themselves. Lady Morton looked at Cale. He stood. He crossed the space between his chair and the central table without hurry. He stood beside Sarah. The mark on her wrist began to glow. It was soft and silver and steady, not dramatic, not the blazing light of stories or the theatrical display of things invented to impress. It was the quiet certainty of something real, a gentle luminescence that was exactly what it was, old and true and alive, in the way of something that had been waiting for its corresponding part, and had now found it. The hall was very quiet. The 12 representatives looked at her wrist. She looked at it too, for just a moment, and in that moment she felt something she had not felt before. Not quite recognition, because she had never been anywhere that recognized her, but something very close to it, something like belonging to an origin she had not known was hers. She looked back at the 12. A mark applied externally, she said quietly, does not do that. The room held its breath. Virith was still. Her expression had not changed. Sarah looked at her for a moment, not with triumph or hostility, just observation, the way she looked at all things she was committing to understanding, and then she looked away, because the moment was not about Virith. Lady Morton called a brief recess. The 12 conferred among themselves in a low, dense cluster near the windows, and Sarah went back to her table and stood beside it, and waited, which was something she was very good at. The recess lasted 22 minutes, which she counted. Then they returned. Lady Morton spoke in the clear, unembellished voice she used for formal proceedings. The vote was 10 in favor of dismissal, 2 abstaining, none in opposition to dismissal. The challenge was formally dismissed. The record was annotated accordingly. Lady Morton made a brief and precise additional statement, noting that the matter of the signed testimony from Ashvale would be referred to the appropriate authority for review as a separate proceeding, as false testimony to the Crown was a matter of its own jurisdiction. It was over. Owen touched her shoulder. Once, briefly, the most he had ever done, and she took it as what it was. Edmund caught her eye across the room, and gave her a small, contained nod, and she saw that his jaw was tight in the way of someone who has been holding tension for the last 2 hours, and is only now releasing it. Cale was still standing beside her. She had not moved after the verdict. She was looking at the documents on her table, the 3 organized stacks, weeks of preparation, reduced to something that had worked, precisely because it was thorough, rather than dramatic. "Sarah," he said. She turned and looked at him. He was close, and his expression was not the usual steady one. It was something underneath the steady, something she had been learning to read and had not finished learning yet. "You did that," he said. It was not a grand statement. It was exact and meant. "I had good source material," she said. He looked at her for a long moment. She looked back. The hall was returning to motion around them, the sound of it swelling back in. People moving, voices beginning again, the ordinary noise of a proceeding that had concluded. But here in the center of it there was a particular kind of quiet that she recognized as the kind that forms around 2 people who are paying close attention to each other and have temporarily stopped caring about the room around them. "I need to tell you something," he said. "All right," she said. "When I came to Ashvale," he said, "I was not looking for anyone. I was doing what I always do, which is covering ground that needs to be covered, and doing the work, and not expecting anything particular from it." He held her gaze steadily. "And then you were standing in the path with your feet in muddy water, and you looked at me like I was simply a thing in your way, and—" A pause, brief and careful. "I have not thought about much else since." She was very still. "That is not a pressure," he said. "I am not telling you because I want you to do something about it. I am telling you because you did something extraordinary today. And you have been doing something extraordinary for 3 months, and I did not want to let it pass without saying so." He stopped. "And because I am apparently incapable of saying simple things simply." She looked at him. She thought about all the things she had been cataloging and not annotating. She thought about the map room in the early mornings, and the shared candlelight in the library, and the notebook he had produced from his saddlebag on the second day of a journey she had not expected. "I thought it was a small thing," she said. "The notebook." He looked at her, a little uncertain of the turn, which was endearing. "You asked for paper, and I had paper," he said. "It was simple." "Nothing is simply simple," she said. She looked at him properly, the way she looked at things she was committing to memory. "Ask me again, in 6 months," she said. "I will have a better answer then." He looked at her, the almost smile, fully becoming itself. 6 months, he said. 6 months, she agreed. She picked up her documents. She straightened the stacks with care. Outside the hall, the citadel was returning to its ordinary day, the corridors filling with the sounds of people going about the work of a large and living place. She walked out of the hall with her documents under her arm, and her sleeve still pushed back, and the mark on her wrist catching the light from the high windows, steady and silver, and exactly what it was. She walked toward the library. She had notes to write, and the archive still needed cataloging, and the work did not stop, because one important thing had been finished. The work never stopped. She had learned that at Ashvale, though the work was different now. Everything about it was different now. She sat at her table, and opened her notebook, and wrote the date at the top of a clean page. Then she wrote, "The mark glowed. 10-2. The challenge is dismissed. The record is corrected." She looked at what she had written. Then she wrote underneath it, in smaller letters, "He said he has not thought about much else since Ashvale. I believe him. I do not know what to do with that yet. 6 months." She closed the notebook. The candle burned. The library held its particular quiet. Outside, the citadel kept going, and she kept going with it. The citadel in early summer had a quality that Sarah had not expected. She had arrived in winter and seen it in its most severe form, all dark stone and gray sky, and the kind of cold that settles into a building's bones. She had seen it through spring, which had been cautious and incremental, each warm day, following the previous one, with the careful confidence of something not yet certain it was allowed. But summer arrived without any of that caution, and the building opened to it the way old buildings open to warmth they have been waiting for, and the result was something she found she liked very much. She had been at the Citadel for 5 months. 5 months was long enough to have opinions about its character in different seasons. She found she had many opinions about many things that had not previously been available to her to have opinions about, which was one of the ongoing effects of living somewhere that treated her as a person with a perspective worth considering. She had also, in 5 months, become someone the court had genuinely integrated into its fabric, not because anything dramatic had happened after the hearing, but because she had simply kept being herself, steadily and without performance, and eventually, the court had adjusted around her, the way water adjusts around a stone, finding the new shape of things and flowing into it. Virith had retracted nothing and apologized for nothing, which Sarah had expected. What she had not expected was that Virith, 3 weeks after the hearing, had appeared in the library on a Tuesday afternoon and sat down across from Sarah without preamble and said, "I would like to understand the bond law sections you cited at the hearing, specifically the historical precedents." Sarah had looked at her for a moment, then she had pushed the relevant text across the table. They had spent 2 hours in the library that afternoon, talking about legal history. It was not a reconciliation. It was not warmth. It was 2 people who were both serious about the same subject sitting in the same room and acknowledging it, which Sarah had decided was more durable than warmth anyway. She had also, over the 5 months, taken on something Owen had tentatively described as a consultative role in the area of records and documentation. This was a formal way of saying that she had identified 3 significant organizational problems in how the Citadel's historical archive was maintained and had presented written solutions for them, and Owen had looked at the solutions and implemented 2 of them immediately and was working through the logistics of the 3rd. Edmund had called this the most quietly radical thing that had happened at the Citadel in years, and had laughed about it for an entire afternoon. Nora had simply updated the household organizational chart without comment, which was, Sarah thought, the more sincere form of acknowledgement. She was in her usual chair in the library, on a warm afternoon, reading a text on pack governance law, when Edmund arrived with his customary timing and 2 cups. "The summer gathering is in 3 weeks, he said, setting her cup beside her book. "I know," she said. "Nora has already discussed it with me. The Highland representatives will be there," he said. He said it without looking at her, which was his way of delivering information that had weight. She looked up. "From the region that includes Ashvale?" "Yes." He finally looked at her, including a new representative from the Ashvale district, following the council restructuring. A pause. "His name is Walter Briggs. He was appointed after the council suspensions. He arrived 2 days ago." She processed this. Walter Briggs was a name she did not know, which meant he was not one of the old guard, which meant the council restructuring had worked at least partially as Cale had intended when he left Ashvale. "Is he someone I should speak to?" she asked. "I think he is someone who would very much like to speak to you," Edmund said. "He is very young for the role. He has already found the library, which I take as a good sign." She set down her pen. "Where is he now?" "Last I saw," Edmund said. "In the history section, looking lost among the old texts." She found Walter Briggs exactly where Edmund said, standing between the rows of the history section with his head tilted sideways to read spines. He was indeed young, with an anxious, earnest face, and the slightly overwhelmed look of someone who had arrived somewhere much larger than anywhere they had been before. He turned around when he heard her footstep, and his expression shifted immediately to something that was part recognition and part careful uncertainty. "Sarah," he said, "I was hoping to speak to you." "Edmund is not subtle about the things he thinks should happen," she said. She gestured toward the table. "Sit, tell me what you want to know." What he wanted to know turned out to be considerable. He had been appointed by the newly structured Ashvale Council, which now contained 3 members who had not previously held positions, and 2 who had but who Fenwick had vouched for, as genuinely capable of change. Walter had grown up in the district. He was 22. He had read about the Lunaris mark in the school texts when he was 14, buried in a footnote of old folklore, and had asked his teachers about it and been told it was mythological. "It is not mythological," she said. "No," he agreed, looking at her wrist, then looking away quickly, which she found unexpectedly touching. "I am sorry," he said, "for what happened there. I was a child, but—" "You were a child," she said. "That is all you need to say about it." He looked at her. He nodded. They talked for 2 hours. She asked him about the district, about what had changed and what had not, about Fenwick's leadership, and whether the changes Cale had mandated were holding. Walter answered carefully and honestly, the way young people answer when they are aware that accuracy matters. When he left, she sat in the library for a while thinking about Ashvale, which she did sometimes, not with the contracted feeling of before, but with the cleaner perspective of distance. She thought about Walter Briggs's anxious, earnest face, and the fact that a 22-year-old who had once been told the Lunaris mark was mythological was now representing the district that had made her carry water. Progress looked like this sometimes. Unglamorous, incremental, real. That evening, there was a knock at her room door, in the particular rhythm she had come to know well. 2 unhurried knocks. "Come in," she said. Cale came in. He looked at her with the kind of look that meant he had something specific to say, and was taking a moment to find the right approach, which she recognized as a pattern. "Walter Briggs," he said. "Edmund told you," she said. "Owen told me." Edmund told Owen. A brief pause. "Edmund tells Owen many things." She almost smiled. "He is worried I might find it difficult, having someone from Ashvale here. Is he right?" She thought about it. "No," she said. "It was useful. And I think Walter is genuinely trying." She looked at Cale. "Your changes to the council structure are working. Slowly, but they are working." He nodded. He was still standing slightly inside the door, which was not his usual approach, and she waited. "There is something else," he said. "All right," she said. He came properly into the room then, and sat in the second chair, and looked at her with the expression she had come to know as the one that preceded honesty. "Owen has raised the question of formal timing," he said. "For the bonding. There is no legal pressure to set a date. The challenge has been dismissed, and the record is clear. But the court is watching, and at some point the watching becomes its own kind of pressure, and I thought, He paused. I do not want you to be surprised by it. I would rather tell you what the landscape is than have you encounter it unexpectedly. She looked at him for a long moment. You told me 6 months, she said. You told me 6 months, he corrected, gently. I did, she agreed. She looked at the window, at the summer evening outside it, the long gold light of a season that had changed the texture of everything. It has been 5 months. Yes, he said. She looked back at him. Ask me when it has been 6, she said. He looked at her, and the expression was not the almost smile. It was something more complete than that, something that had been building across 5 months of early mornings, and shared candlelight, and conversations, in which neither of them was performing anything, and she felt it in her chest, the same way she felt the warmth of tea on cold mornings, real, and immediate, and worth keeping. All right, he said. He left. She sat in her room with the summer evening outside her window, and the notebook on her desk, and the blanket in the chest, and the mark on her wrist, that was simply hers now, simply a fact of her, and she thought about 23 days, which was the distance to 6 months, and she thought that she was ready, and had been ready for a while, and was simply finishing the last piece of the thing she had needed to complete before she said so. The last piece was not about the court, or the mark, or the politics of the citadel. It was not about Virith, or the challenge, or the hearing, or any of the things that had tested her in the past 5 months. All of that had been difficult, and real, and she had moved through it, and come out larger. The last piece was something smaller and more private. It was the question she had been asking herself since the first morning in Ashvale, when she walked toward the council hall in the green dress with her sleeve pushed back. It was the question underneath all the other questions. She opened her notebook. She wrote, I need to know that choosing this is choosing, not arriving at it, because nothing else was offered. She sat with that for a while. Then she wrote, I came here because I chose to. I stayed because I chose to. The challenge came, and I handled it, and afterward I felt larger, not smaller. I did that, not anyone else. Me. She read what she had written. Then she wrote, I think I know the answer now. I think I have known it for several weeks. I am waiting to say it out loud, because saying it out loud means something, and I want to be certain before I make it real. She closed the notebook. She sat by the window until the summer sky finally gave up its light and the stars appeared, and she counted 23 days in her mind and thought about what she would say when they had passed. She already knew. 6 months was not exactly what happened. It was 5 months and 23 days, which Sarah could calculate precisely, because she was the kind of person who noted dates, and what happened was not what she had imagined, which was a conversation in the map room, or the library, or somewhere quiet and considered. What happened was a Tuesday evening in the kitchen corridor, which was not considered at all. She had been returning from the kitchen, where she had gone because she could not sleep, and because the cook, a cheerful man named Aldous, who had no relation to the noble representative Aldous Crane, and had laughed until tears came when she pointed this out, kept a pot of something warm available through the night for anyone who needed it. She was walking through the lower corridor with a cup in each hand, when she nearly walked into Cale, who was coming from the opposite direction, with a book under his arm, and an expression that suggested he had also not been sleeping. They both stopped. She looked at him. He looked at her. The corridor was empty, and the citadel was quiet around them, with the particular quiet of a large building at night, when the people in it have mostly decided to stop. Kitchen? She asked. Library, he said. Again. You could sleep, she suggested. You could also sleep, he said. I was going to try, she said, holding up both cups. This helps sometimes. He looked at the second cup, then he looked at her. All right, he said. They did not go to any room in particular. They ended up in the courtyard garden, which was not the most sensible place in November. But the sky was clear, and the cold was the clean, sharp kind. Not the damp cold that seeps into everything, but the cold that makes the world feel exact and awake. There was a covered section along the wall where the stone bench was dry. They sat with the cups between them, and the quiet and the dark sky full of stars that looked different at this elevation than they had from Ashvale, closer and more numerous, as though the citadel's height had shaved some of the distance. She told him this, and he said that was the altitude, technically, and she said she knew what altitude was, and he said she had just called it height, and she said height and altitude were the same word, and he said they were not quite, and she said the difference was negligible in conversation, and he said in surveying it very much was not, and she said she was not surveying. By the end of this she was smiling, and he was doing the thing with his mouth that was fully a smile now, had been for several weeks, and the smile did what it had always done, in the split second before it properly arrived, which was to make everything it landed on feel like the right thing. The quiet came back and it was comfortable, the kind she had stopped expecting from other people, because most people needed to fill silences, and this was a silence that did not need filling. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Yes." "When I said 6 months," she said, carefully, "what did you think I meant?" He was quiet for a moment. "I thought you meant you needed time," he said, "to know whether you could trust what was here." She looked at the cup in her hands. "That was part of it," she said. "Was there another part?" She considered how to say it. She was usually precise, but some things required a different kind of honesty, the kind that is less exact and more true. "I have never been given anything without a cost," she said, "not in Ashvale, not anywhere. Something is offered, and then there is a price that was not disclosed at the beginning, something extracted from you before you realized you had agreed to pay it." She looked at the stars. "So when someone offers me something that seems large, I wait. I wait to see what the cost turns out to be." He was listening with the full quality of his attention that she had come to know, the kind that did not drift or manage itself, or try to find the response before the speaking was finished. "The challenge," she said. "Vireth's challenge. I was prepared for it, because I had been waiting for the cost of being here to show itself." She kept looking at the sky. "And it did. And I handled it. And afterward," she paused. "Afterward?" he prompted, gently. "I realized the cost had been mine to pay," she said. "Not something extracted by someone else. The challenge was difficult and real, but it required me to defend myself, which I did, using what I know, and who I am. And afterward, I felt like something I had been holding was lighter." She looked at him. "I think that means it was mine, not a cost imposed on me, a thing I went through and came out of." A pause. "I have not had many of those. Most of the hard things in my life made me smaller afterward, not larger. This one did not." He was looking at her in the way she had learned over 5 months, the steady, specific quality of it, that was not inspection, but was something more like recognition. "Is that what you needed the 6 months for?" he asked. "Partly," she said. "I also needed to know that I could navigate this place on my own terms, that I was here because I chose to be, not because I was brought here and found no way out." She turned the cup in her hands. "I needed to know the difference between being placed somewhere and arriving." She paused. "It sounds like the same thing." "It is not the same thing," he said. "No," she agreed, "it is not." The garden was very still around them. The covered bench held the cold at bay enough to sit without discomfort. In the branches of the nearest shrub, something small and alive made a brief sound and went quiet again. "And now?" he asked. "Now I know the difference," she said. "I arrived here. I have been arriving here, piece by piece, since the first morning. The mark did not arrive me. The law did not arrive me. I did." He was quiet. Then he said, slowly, "I think you are one of the most remarkable people I have encountered in a very long life." She looked at him. "How old are you actually?" He blinked. Then he made a sound that was fully a laugh, surprised and genuine, and she thought she had heard him laugh that way perhaps twice before, both times in the kitchen corridor when Aldous said something unexpected, and it was a good sound, unguarded and real. "I am asking a serious question," she said. "I know," he said. "I am 43. "That is not very old," she said. "No," he agreed. "I was being slightly dramatic." "You are not usually dramatic." "Around you. I occasionally am," he said. "I have not worked out what to do about that." She looked at him, and felt the warmth in her chest, that she had been cataloging for months, and had now stopped cataloging, because it had become simply the warmth in her chest, which was where it lived now, which was where it had moved in at some point, without asking permission, and which she had decided she did not want to evict. "I think," she said, "that I am going to ask you to tell me again what you told me in the Great Hall." He understood immediately. She could see it in his face. the way the expression shifted to something quiet and careful and honest. I said that I have not thought about much else since you were standing in the path in Ashvale with your feet in muddy water, he said, and that you did something extraordinary, and I did not want to let it pass without saying it. And now, she said. Now, he said, I want to know what you want, not what the mark indicates, and not what the court expects. What you, Sarah, want. She thought about it the way she thought about all real questions, properly, and without rushing, and with the intention of saying something true. I want to keep reading, she said, and keep walking in the early mornings, and keep having the kind of conversations where neither person is performing something for the other. She looked at him steadily. I want to build something that is mine, and was not handed to me. I think I can do that here. She paused. And I think you are someone I want to be around while I do it. Not because of the mark, not because the law points here, because of the notebook. He looked at her for a long moment. The notebook, he said. You gave it to me without making a thing of it, she said. That was when I knew. Small true things tell you more than large gestures. He was quiet for a moment, then he said, simply, all right. She looked at the stars. She felt the cold air, and the warmth of the cup, and the warmth in her chest, that was simply hers now. I was afraid to want things, she said. For a long time, it was easier not to. I know, he said. I am not afraid of it now, she said. I know that too, he said. And there was something in his voice, low and even and certain, that made her believe it fully. The way you believe things that are said without performance or effort. The way you believe the sun when it comes through a window on a cold morning. She finished the tea. The stars stayed where they were, unhurried. The garden waited patiently around them, holding the particular silence of November, which is the month that knows what winter is, and has accepted it without resentment. She did not look away from him. He did not look away from her. It was the most like herself she had ever been in a moment with another person. She held it the way she held all useful things, carefully and without letting go. They sat in the covered section of the garden until the cold finally made further sitting impractical, and then they went inside, and she went to her room, and he went to his, and she sat at her desk and opened her notebook. She wrote 4 words. They were, I am not afraid. She put the notebook in the chest beside the blanket her mother had made. Then she put out the candle and lay down and looked at the ceiling in the dark and let herself feel, for a moment, the full weight of where she was and how she had gotten here, not the suffering part of it, and not the arrival part of it, but both parts together, the full honest shape of it, 20 years, and a muddy path, and a man on a black horse, who had stopped, and asked her name, and meant it. Then she breathed out. Then she slept. The morning of the bonding ceremony arrived without announcement, the way all important mornings do. Sarah had been at the Citadel for 9 months, nearly to the day. She had watched summer turn to autumn in the courtyard garden, and autumn harden into the particular cold of a place built into the side of a mountain. She had watched the valley below change color 4 times now, and with each change, she had felt herself become a little more of a person who came from here, which was different from a person who had arrived here, and the difference mattered. She had done many things in 9 months. She had drafted, with Owen and a legal representative named Clara, who had a mind like a filing system, and the same preference for precision that Sarah recognized in herself, a new policy for the Citadel, regarding people who arrived from lower-ranked packs, without standard documentation. The policy established a clear process for record correction, and ensured that no one could be officially classified on the basis of a council declaration that lacked supporting source evidence. It had passed through the noble representatives in 4 weeks, which Owen told her was unusually fast, and which she had not been surprised by, because she had spent 3 weeks preparing for every possible objection, and the objections, when they came, had already been answered in the document. She had also started a cataloging project in the library that would, when finished, connect the Citadel's historical archive to the regional library system, making documents accessible to scholars across the territory. Edmund had described this as the best thing that had happened at court since the challenge hearing. He had said this with complete sincerity, and then noticed the implications, and started to say something else, and she had told him to leave it, and he had laughed until the table shook. She had spoken to Vireth properly, in the library, 6 weeks after the challenge. Not to argue, or to settle anything, to talk. Virith had looked at her with the complicated expression she always wore, and had said, in the voice of someone being more honest than they had planned to be, that she had underestimated her. Sarah had said she had noticed. Virith had said she would not make that mistake again. Sarah had said good, and had meant it as an equal rather than a warning, and Virith had heard it that way. They were not friends. They were something more interesting than friends. They were two people who had stood on opposite sides of something difficult and come through it to a place of specific mutual clarity, and Sarah had decided that was worth more than friendliness, which came easy and meant less. She had filled 4 notebooks. She had started a 5th. She had had many conversations in the courtyard garden at night, when neither of them was sleeping, which happened often enough to have become a pattern neither of them named or drew attention to. She had had conversations in the map room and the library and the kitchen, where Aldous provided tea and commentary in equal measure, and pretended not to be listening to either of them, with complete transparent failure. She had argued about the difference between height and altitude, and been wrong, and accepted it. She had learned what it felt like to have someone look at her like she was the answer to something they had been asking for a long time. She had learned what it felt like to look back the same way. And now it was morning, and the light was coming through the east-facing window, the window that had been the first thing she had noted as belonging to her on the day she arrived, and Nora was at the door with the dress. It was not elaborate. Sarah had been clear about that. She did not want elaborate. She wanted something that was hers, chosen for the reasons she was choosing all things now, because she wanted it, and it fit, and it was true. The dress was deep green, the color she had worn on her first night at the Citadel, because that color had been the first color she had ever been given, and she had decided it felt right to close this circle in it, to go from the first night to this morning wearing the same thing, and be the same person, only more herself. She put on the dress. She looked at herself in the small mirror she had brought from Ashvale, the one she had carried in her bag across 6 miles, and then 3 days of travel, and then 9 months of living, and she saw the same face she had always seen, the same dark eyes, the same person who had stood with muddy water on her feet and looked at a king without looking away. She was still that person. That was the thing she had needed to be certain of before today, and had been certain of for some time now. She had not changed into someone else. She had expanded into more of herself. The expansion was the point. She went downstairs. The ceremony was in the old hall, the one with the dark wood paneling, and the candlelight, and the centuries of having held people in moments exactly like this, and very different from this. The candles were lit even though it was morning, which she had asked for, because the candles made the old stone look like what it was, which was something that had been here long before any of them, and would be here long after. The noble representatives were present. The household staff who wanted to be there were there, which turned out to be most of them. Owen was standing near the front, in a coat she had never seen him wear before, dark and well-fitted, and she understood from the coat that he owned exactly one formal coat, and had been waiting for an occasion that felt worth it, and she was glad this was that occasion. Edmund was standing near the windows with an expression that was working very hard not to be visibly moved, and was losing the effort entirely. She looked at him for a moment, and he gave her a small, contained nod that was also somehow enormous. Nora was near the side wall. Nora was not crying. Nora was holding her hands together in front of her with the precision of someone who has decided not to cry, and is applying exactly enough concentration to make that decision stick. Cale was at the front of the room. He was wearing dark clothing, as he usually did, but with the formal detail of the Draven bloodline along the collar, which she recognized from the historical texts, because she had read the historical texts, all of them, which was the kind of person she was. His expression was the serious one, the outer face that covered everything else, but underneath it was the other thing, the real thing, the thing that had been there from the first morning in the council hall in Ashvale when he said please and meant it. She walked down the center of the hall. She did not look at the 12 representatives, or at Owen, or at Edmund, or at Nora. She looked at him, because he was the point of walking toward, and she had learned over 9 months, and a whole life before that the only direction worth walking was toward the things you had chosen, with your eyes open. Lady Morton conducted the ceremony. She had a strong, clear voice, and she did not embellish, which Sarah appreciated. The bond declaration was simple, as the oldest form of it always was, the language that had survived 600 years, because it said exactly what it needed to say, and nothing else. Two names, two voices, two people acknowledging one another in the presence of the community they were part of, as a statement of fact. When the moment came for Sarah to speak, she spoke. Her voice was level. She was not nervous, as she had known she would not be. She was simply present, fully and completely, which was something she was very good at, and had always been very good at, even in the years when there was nowhere worth being present in. She spoke her acknowledgement, and he spoke his, and when the words were finished, the hall was quiet for a moment, with the specific quiet of a thing that has just become real. Then the candlelight caught the mark on her wrist, which was bare, as it had been for 9 months now, never covered again, and for a moment, it glowed with that soft silver light, the light of something ancient that had been waiting, and had now found what it was waiting for. She looked at it. She did not feel the mark the way she had felt it in the great hall, external and demonstrating something to a room of people. She felt it the way she had started to feel it in the months after the hearing, as part of her, a fact of her body, old and hers. Not a wound and not a question, and not something imposed on her by anyone's interpretation of it. Just a mark that was as much her as her hands and her eyes, and the voice she had used just now to say the words that were now real. She looked at Cale. He was looking at her. She thought about Ashvale briefly, not with the old contracted feeling but with the calm, clear distance of someone looking back from the right elevation. She thought about the east window of her small room, and the shelf of books, and the morning she had stood in the muddy path, and refused to look away. She thought about her mother's blanket, which was in the chest at the foot of her bed here, still hers, still kept, still the one thing from before that she had brought forward. She thought about impure and harmless, and all the words that had been laid on her without her consent. Then she stopped thinking about all of that and was simply here. "Well," Owen said, from somewhere to the side, and the word carried everything that a man who does not say unnecessary things can put into a single word when he chooses to say one. The room came back to life around it. Laughter moved through the space, warm and genuine, and the kind that happens when people have been holding something and finally let it go. Edmund laughed loudest and longest, and she caught his eye, and he shook his head slowly, as though she had done something he had hoped for, but had not quite let himself expect. Nora made no sound, but when Sarah looked at her, Nora pressed her lips together, in the specific expression of someone who has lost the fight against feeling something, and has decided to accept the loss with dignity. She looked back at Cale. He was still looking at her, and she thought about what it meant to have someone look at you, and see not what they needed you to be, and not what the law said you were, and not what the mark indicated you might become, but simply you, the actual person standing there, exactly as you were. She thought it meant something she had not had a word for until recently. She had a word for it now. She reached out and took his hand. His hand was steady and certain, the hand of someone who had been waiting a long time without always knowing what he was waiting for, and who had recognized it immediately when it arrived. He held hers the same way. Outside the hall, the citadel went on. Beyond the citadel, the territory went on, wide and old and full of packs and people and councils, and the long, difficult work of doing things rightly. There were new policies to finish, and archives to catalog, and a morning walk waiting in the courtyard garden as soon as this was done. There was Edmund Hale, who would want to discuss every detail of the ceremony over coffee for the rest of the afternoon. There was a fifth notebook that was already half full. There was the library, always the library, still only half catalogued, waiting with the particular patience of libraries, which is the most patient thing in the world. There was a great deal to do. She had never minded that. She stood in the old hall with the candles and the wood and the centuries and the people she had chosen, and she was here, and she was herself, and the mark on her wrist caught the candlelight, and she let it. She did not look away. She had never been able to, and she had decided, finally and completely, and without reservation, that this was not a flaw in her character. It was simply who she was, and who she was had turned out to be enough. More than enough. The kind of enough that does not need to be measured because it has already filled the room. The candles burned, the hall held them, the morning kept going. And Sarah kept going with it, which was, she thought, the truest thing that could be said about her. She had always kept going. Now she was keeping going somewhere she had chosen, toward something she had built, beside someone she had decided. And the difference between that and everything that came before was not a small difference. It was the whole world.